Boom, and we're live. Welcome back to the podcast. As always, this is Johnny, and with me, as always, is Abdallah.
The lonely chemist.
The lone chemist. I don't want to be.
Chemist.
They don't want to be too self-deprecating with my words. So.
Okay. All right. Sounds good.
And also, I'm a fan of the Western movies. So, Lone Ranger, Lone Chemist. I thought that kind of segued nicely into my movie fanboydom. You know.
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure there's good movie titles with the word lonely in it too, as well. Can't think of anything off the top of my head. I don't know.
Maybe. We'll have to Wikipedia that or something. Anyway, all right. So Abdallah is departing from Evanston, Illinois in a few minutes. But before he does, we thought we'd do a little talk on a subject that I think is really fascinating. We're going to talk about effective world building in movies and what makes a complete, logically consistent world, and some examples of worlds that have worked very, very well and worlds that maybe have not worked so well, and what we think could be the determining factors in those things working or not.
Sure. We'll take this as a practice run for us writing our own screenplays in the future, but making sure that we figure out what is a good world building, not only with regards to source material that's already present that is adapted into movies, but what about completely original screenplays that are directly translated into movies? How have they worked, and what do they need to do better in order to lead to better movies?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to be able to adapt like a beloved story, like for example, like Lord of the Rings, when you have like an actual literary standpoint. But when you have something really original, I mean, even if a movie is bad or the world isn't really effective, you kind of have to commend them for synthesizing a completely new way to tell stories in this new world, like completely originally.
Right.
So in that sense, I think world building is a pretty complex thing that not many authors and not many screenwriters can do very effectively.
Right.
But when they do it effectively, obviously it makes a world that is completely believable, and it's a good feat.
Yeah, one of the things that also comes up all the time is a lot of these properties, if you will, that are being adapted now are only being adapted now because the technology finally has allowed us to get to it.
Sure.
Something like Lord of the Rings, for the 50 years before it was properly adapted, was considered unfilmable. Not only because it would just require such a massive scale that's never been done before in order to be properly and faithfully reproduced. So given the fact that you can say the technological advances are there, what are some of the techniques that filmmaking sort of has innovated recently that can probably add an extra layer? And I chose my words carefully because one of the movies we'll talk about in this podcast is Avatar, and we'll focus on its effective usage of three-dimensional space within a movie to see how that extra dimension really made a difference in terms of the world building.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we should talk about just world building generally, not really speaking about the technological advances first, but
Absolutely.
Just what actually goes into writing and creating a world from scratch. So I think that the number one factor for an effective world, and by effective I mean believable, like we as the audience have to buy into the world that we're presented in a medium, give it film or a screenplay or a book or something. I think the number one rule that someone has to abide by when they're making a world that is somewhat believable is internal logic. I think that,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it has to not only be, logical, but it has to be consistently logical. It can't just have a rule that goes in place of another rule, and it can't be just some mishmash of different facts and different realities. So I think that the clearest example of that would be something like Harry Potter. I think Harry Potter is, as a series, probably the most lucrative and the most effective world that's probably been put into writing and also into film. So like I was thinking, why has Harry Potter been such a phenomenon, and why has it been such an effective thing for so many people to buy into? I think that one of the defining factors is just the logic that goes into the world. Like for example, you have obviously the allegory of maturation, growing up in America or growing up in the UK or whatever, and you discover these things about yourselves, and so you have to learn to control them. You have to learn to control being a magical person. So in today's world, we harness intelligence by going to school. And in this world, okay, if you have all these powers that are imbued to you, then where would you go? You wouldn't, go to a regular school to learn how to do this. You go to a different school. And obviously it has to be segregated from the general population. It would be a boarding school. And so you have this parallel between people who learn how to use their abilities in the regular, Earth that we live in today versus the magical world, and the logic proceeds almost in the same way that it would if it actually happened in real life.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why it was so beloved and readily embraced is the fact that you as the audience member can suspend your disbelief, but at the same time, this world could totally happen. We can be living in the midst of wizards and not know that they exist. Because obviously, we as muggles, the audience members as muggles, would not be aware of the existence of magical creatures that would defeat their purpose of existence. And then, within that, they have even rules that are set up in terms of how these magical beings are supposed to interact with muggles. Obviously, you can't show magic in front of muggles, otherwise you have to wipe the muggles' memories. You have a Minister of Magic who's also in direct contact with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. That makes sense because you can say the Prime Minister of Great Britain is the only only muggle who's allowed to know of the existence of magical creatures.
Yeah. Except for squibs, who are magical, relatives, but they also are.
And so that's the other thing is that I think one of the largest concessions that is actually very clever is the fact that you can't have magical blood without having magical powers. So squibs must exist within this universe, as well as the other way around, where you do not have magical blood, but you do have magical powers. So a muggle-born wizard.
Like Hermione.
Like Hermione. So,
yeah.
And given that the fact that these people are allowed to exist, you also have society reacting differently to them. So somebody like Hermione, her parents were very eager to have somebody like her in the family. But you look at somebody like Harry Potter's mother, who basically was ostracized from her family once they found out that she had powers.
Yeah.
Because Petunia was not only was jealous, and then she sort of turned her anger into resentment and basically, I'm no longer going to be associated with my sister. She's a disgrace to the family. And so there are real world parallels you can see, something like the X-Men have actually done pretty well. Which is,
for sure, yeah. X-Men 2 is a brilliant allegory for racism and discrimination.
Racism and, homophobia, and even one particular line from X-Men First Class was when Nicholas Holt's character, Beast, when Charles Xavier technically outed him as a mutant because nobody was aware that he was a mutant. And, somebody asked him, well, I didn't know you were a mutant. He said, well, you didn't ask, so I didn't tell. And that's a perfect allegory to, queer people in general being sort of repressing their identity for their own safety in some ways. And, if the real world found out these magical creatures existed, well, they would be persecuted. They would be probably rounded up, and they would try to extort their powers and for the benefit of humans, sort of what the humans would do to mutants if they actually caught them. So those are all sort of logical things that would flow from a story being imagined in this way, and actually they are properly addressed in this work, I believe. Yeah,
and also, the logic even extends to the minutia of the way they use magic. Like, for example, all of the spells come from Latin-based or Greek-based words.
Right.
J.K. Rowling took very, very careful consideration as to what words to use and how to use them, syllable construction and all that. I really struggle to find any kind of logical inconsistencies of that world.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's been so relatable for so many people. It's been a global phenomenon that everyone can latch onto. It can be, a lot of people say that it's an allegory for religion and Christianity. A lot of people say that it's just a perfect representation of growing up in America, feeling different. And that all kind of stems from the fact that it's logically set up. It goes from the fact that J.K. Rowling had the entire story in her head before she even put pen to paper. She knew roughly how the story was going to begin and end. And then because those were set up in a logical way, she had all these little, bids and payoffs throughout the story. The Horcrux example I would give is, you don't really know that it's a Horcrux, the diary, right?
The diary in the second book.
Yeah, the diary in the second book, and the basilisk fang stabs it and kills it, and you don't really understand why. But then slowly, those details about those objects are introduced, and it all follows the same kind of logical structure that's laid out when they're first introduced in the second book.
Right.
I just people can learn a lot about world building from J.K. Rowling's books, for
Right.
sure.
You know, another example of a Horcrux is Regulus Black's locket, where you know, he was in 12 Grimmauld Place. He was there in book 5, and when they were doing a cleanup of the house, they found this locket that nobody could open, and they thought it was basically complete trash. They discarded it, and it turns out it was actually a very important MacGuffin because it contained part of Voldemort's soul, and it made sense that you couldn't open it except with very powerful magic or eventually by speaking Parseltongue and actually asking it to open. So, and then the last time she did that was in book 6. There was a, you know, when Harry Potter was using the Half-Blood Prince potion book, Snape sort of had an inkling that this was what was happening, that Harry Potter somehow got a hold of his old book and was using it, and Harry Potter needed to hide the book, so he goes into the room of requirement, the place where you hide everything, and as he's navigating his way through an aisle to try to hide his book, he comes across a battered old tiara.
Oh yeah,
and has his book around there, you know, puts it on a gargoyle's head so that he can recognize exactly where he puts his book. It turns out that tiara was also a Horcrux. So these little details that she sprinkles in, and they really end up paying off.
Yeah, I would say so for sure.
World building, sometimes what is important is the small details because they end up mattering a whole lot. So in terms of the characterization of Harry Potter himself, his physical characterization, the fact that he has this lightning shaped scar, it's a striking detail. You don't understand what it means until, you know, in our cases, the end of the first book, where you find out exactly how he got that scar and what that scar actually means in terms of his connection with Voldemort, the fact that Voldemort's soul actually resides in his body. And another physical detail of his is just how much he resembles his father. Why does that matter? It matters because of his relationship with Severus Snape. Severus Snape is somebody who's actually sworn to protect him his entire life, but he cannot bring himself to love him because he resembles his worst enemy.
Yeah.
And finally, Harry Potter has his mother's eyes.
Yep.
And that is a very important detail that ends up mattering at the end. We don't find out the true significance of it until the end. And so it's a very carefully and meticulously layered world that she builds and actually has it fall in place in a very striking manner, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So aside from logic, I think we should also talk about, you know, the actual devices that are used to convey a story. And so that can be a number of things. It could be a MacGuffin, like you said. It could be, you know, an actual event that takes place and the flowery description of the event. I think the most effective way to build a world is to have an audience-like character that's just completely relatable in every way.
Sure.
Because, you know, we can see it in every story. I mean, we just talked about Harry Potter. Harry Potter doesn't even know he's a wizard until like 40 pages into the first book. And even by the 7th book, he's still learning about the world that he's presented with.
Right.
And, you know, we as a third party reading the book, we don't really know the actual the inner workings of the world that we're presented. Similar to how, you know, Harry Potter, he realizes that he's famous and he has no really any clue why he's so famous. He walks into, you know, Diagon Alley and everyone's looking at him and they see the scar and they say he's the boy who lived. And we're like that, it's a parallel to the person reading the book in which that we don't really understand what's going on.
Right.
And we kind of learn it as we go. Another thing is all of his friends, for example, even Hermione, who didn't grow up in the magical world, but she's embraced it from the time she was a kid. And Ron Weasley, who is not as powerful as Harry, but is basically affluent in the world of wizardry because Harry didn't grow up there, but Ron did. And so constantly he's learning from these people who introduce different bids to him throughout the story.
Right.
And I feel like that's just a genius way to do it. A lot of stories do that. I mean, if you even go past Harry Potter, something like Inception, for example, Ellen Page's character, Ariadne, she has no idea about this dream hunting and dream building world that Cobb throws her into.
Right.
But because she's so, oblivious to what's going on in the world, then we actually learn along with her.
Right.
And so it presents kind of a situation in which a character can serve as the the linchpin for the audience and kind of our segue into understanding that world.
Sure.
I think it's definitely necessary for any kind of world.
Yeah,
that's effective.
in both of those cases, what some of the other similarities that come to play is these characters are not necessarily the sexiest characters that you would like to have your as a protagonist. You know, Harry Potter himself, he was an orphan. We don't really understand the way his parents died until, you know, later on in the story. It becomes more relatable that way. You know, his adopted family, in quotations, they absolutely despise him. Basically, his aunt hated his mother, and hated the idea of what he is. You know, something that she could not be. And you know, he lived in a cupboard his entire life. So basically, finding out that he's a wizard, and actually a preternaturally talented wizard at that, and that's something that, you know, is rewarding to the reader, because you're given a character, you know, who immediately sort of seeks out your empathy, but then actually, once he earns your empathy, is somebody who can actually reward it.
Yeah.
Ariadne is preternaturally talented as an architect. You can see when she's learning about the ability to build up dreams, she does it very well.
Yeah.
And it's actually, you know, Cobb is actually very impressed and yet scared at the same time. And so the way you see the architectures that she's built up paying off on screen is very satisfying in that reason. And, you know, I would say the gold standard for world building is something like, you know, the world of Middle Earth that, you know, that J.R. Tolkien created. And so, you know, you have these relatable characters like, you know, Bilbo Baggins, Frodo Baggins. These are people that, once again, you're immediately taken in by them, by the characterization. Bilbo started off as somebody who, you know, let's call him somebody who was way too comfortable living the life he lived. Because he sort of swore off adventures at a young age and, you know, became comfortable. But as soon as he's presented with an opportunity to actually seek out adventures, even though he's initially reluctant, when he actually decides to go into the journey, is something that's actually very rewarding for the reader to follow his path. The book is structured as a buildings roman. So you have a character who starts off very naive, and over the course of his adventures learns a lot about the world around him. And it's a fantastic world.
Yeah.
A lot of these elements is something he would have never encountered otherwise. And you as the reader are discovering at the same time as him. So that is probably the most effective tool of world building, is to have a very relatable, very empathic character that you buy into and actually are invested in how they succeed within the world.
Yeah, and I think even further than that, I mean, obviously the audience character is really important, but you can't just throw the audience character into a vacuum. You have to have an established world that's laid out for the person to discover. And even more than that, you have to have, if we're going to talk about archetypes here, like an audience character, I think there has to be a guide sort of character.
Sure.
That will guide them through, you know, the actual learning about the world that they're going to embark in. And so, you know, for Harry Potter, there are a number of guide characters. Pretty much everybody that Harry encounters at Hogwarts is a guide character.
Yep.
He learns a certain lesson from pretty much everyone he encounters. I think the most clear ones are probably, you know, Hermione and Ron, and Dumbledore's obviously a huge one.
Dumbledore.
And in some ways, even Snape. In Lord of the Rings, Bilbo learns from pretty much everybody. I mean, I think Gandalf is probably
Gandalf would be the archetypal character.
the guide.
The wise old man with the long beard and white hair. You know, the Merlin character, I would say, I don't know if Merlin would be the originator of that sort of role, but at least in mythology, I'm sure there are other characters as well, but that's the inspiration for these modern authors, for sure.
Yeah, he's definitely the OG kind of wizard
of
the world.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Merlin's a guide, because Merlin's kind of like the advice giver, like halfway through the story of King Arthur.
Sure.
And he's kind of like the sage of the world and knows everything, but I don't know if I would call Merlin a guide. And could he be, you think?
I guess in some you can always reimagine the story and put him in that role, which wouldn't be out of character, I don't think.
Yeah, for sure. And then going through, you know, something like Inception, Ariadne learns from Cobb and pretty much everybody on the Dreamweaving team.
Right.
So, yeah, no, you need an audience character and a guide that are commensal with one another and have a really good relationship.
Yeah. And one of the things is part of the archetype of our protagonist is in some cases the protagonist increases in power as the story goes on, but then in key moments, it is through their own devices that they progress without the help of the guide character. And this was actually, in some cases, some people may actually complain about the Hobbit because Gandalf is not really around when he's really most needed.
Yeah.
It's kind of the character who shows up, towards the end. It's like kind of like a Deus Ex Machina himself.
Sure.
He's not around when the trolls were trying to eat Bilbo and the dwarves, but he shows up the last moment, actually saves them. When it comes to the I guess the orcs or the goblins as they're called in the book, that chapter he wasn't around the entire time, but he shows up when they need him. With the wargs, he shows up when they need him. So what that means is you are leaving, and obviously in the episode with the dragon, he's not there at all, and he shows up towards the end of the Battle of Five Armies and actually prevents a cataclysm. And so you have the main characters making the decisions that are most impactful in the book, and so that is something that is necessary for world building because these are the key decisions. Bilbo Baggins, once he has the ring, what are the decisions he makes? First of all, the decision making to actually acquire the ring from Gollum, decisions made while he was alone in a cave with Smaug, and most importantly, the decision that he makes with the Arkenstone. Those are the key decisions that are present in the book, that are where the main character, having learned from his entire adventure, actually has a chance to shine, and in some cases they do that very well. Harry Potter makes similarly hard decisions during his time, and obviously in the end succeeds. The most important decision being, and something that was indirectly given by Dumbledore, which is when he finds out he's an actual Horcrux himself, and therefore he has to die. But he actually had to choose to die.
Yeah.
And he knew that basically as he was walking there, and basically it was his decision to sacrifice himself that actually caused him to survive, because if it was anyone else, it would not have worked.
He would have just been killed.
He would have just been killed, and that was it. Voldemort would have survived. But so these are all allowed within the world that they built. It's part of the logic, and continues to be that way.
For sure. So, other than are there any kind of archetypes you think that are necessary for a world to be effective besides like the guide and the audience type character?
In terms of people,
I think an oppressor would be I don't know about an oppressor, but some kind of malevolent force that is in the world that they have to battle. I mean, there are some cases where you don't really
Dark
need,
Lord.
Yeah, a Dark Lord. I mean, you don't really have it in something like Inception. You have just a general goal that you have to do. There isn't like a villain you have to fight or something like that.
Right.
But generally speaking, there has to be a malevolent action that needs to be remedied as the course of the journey progresses.
Right.
And so obviously Harry Potter and Voldemort is a pretty good example of that. In The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, which I'll probably talk about, Sauron, and also the other malevolent characters like the orcs and Saruman.
Yeah.
Is more important.
Dark Wizard.
Yeah.
Before, and that's something that you kind of have to give J.R.R. Tolkien some credit, because in the Hobbit you had the Necromancer, who we found out is Sauron. The Necromancer was not a direct threat in the Hobbit. It was somebody that they conceived could be a potential threat, and as they understood slowly who he is, the Lord of the Rings basically needed to happen once the world had been effectively built by the Hobbit. And the Hobbit is kind of a children's novel, so the Lord of the Rings, because you introduced that, had to be a little bit darker.
Yeah, for sure.
And the tone had to change, but the world built was still consistently logical given the precedent in The Hobbit. You can argue that some elements had to be retconned a little bit. For example, the story of the ring and the caves of Gollum. You can say maybe some details had to be reimagined in order for it to really fit the story of the Lord of the Rings. And it's not only, you can say the Lord of the Rings was sort of an expansion for something that already existed, like The Hobbit, but we can also consider the adaptation, the Peter Jackson movies and the Lord of the Rings, understanding the entire world that Tolkien had built. Because once he wrote the book, he had some annals of the Lord of the Rings, some additional details that would be useful for the readers to know. Peter Jackson, having had all of that information, had to make some creative decisions when he came to adapting the books, and part of it was changing some of the characterizations of the characters, but in meaningful ways. And so one example I can give, for example, is the character of Faramir, who, he's kind of a somewhat a tragic character in the movies. Somebody who's really pining for his father's love, and somebody who's really seeking to prove himself so that he can prove himself worthy of his brother, who his father loved to his detriment. And so part of it was, what would be the ideal way for him to prove himself is to be able to bring the ring back to Gondor. And so when he happens upon Frodo, he looks at the ability to bring the ring back to Gondor as a chance for him to show his quality and earn his father's love and respect. In the book, he would just, he basically dismisses the ring and says, this is something that I would not pick up if I happened upon it. So that logically didn't make sense with what the movie was trying to accomplish about the ring being
it corrupts even the purest souls, and like anybody who's a man will basically fall such
exactly.
Which is why the Hobbit is such a good, well hobbits in general are a good vehicle to deliver the ring
Absolutely.
to its eventual destruction.
They're the ones who would be most resistant to its evil.
I mean, Aragorn even says to Frodo, like, "Don't tempt me, Frodo. If I touch that thing, then I will never come back."
Right.
And you see that basically throughout the entire story.
Yeah. So
people see the ring and like that strange like dissonant music plays, and they zoom in on the ring and all that, and so. I would agree that there's kind of a bit of a logical inconsistency there, but I think it serves a story,
It serves a story because part of the, an adaptation, cinematics versus literary work do require different sort of logic to them. And so when you're doing an adaptation, you do have some choices to make in order to generally simplify the story for that type of medium, but then you simplify it in a way that is still consistent, not only within the world that is built in the source material, but also within the cinematic world as well. In some cases you actually have room to become very, you have room for filmmakers to be innovative. So for example, Harry Potter, I think Harry Potter, the franchise itself, maybe had a total of 4 directors, if I'm not mistaken. Or
it was Chris Columbus for the first 2, Alfonso Cuarón.
And then did what's his name?
Michael Newell did number 4.
Okay.
And then David Yates, I think, did the rest of them.
Did the rest of them, right?
End.
So the aesthetics that they all utilized were very different. So Christopher Columbus was more whimsical, more, I think, better fit for a children's book.
Well, the first 2 are definitely more innocent.
More innocent, exactly.
Yeah.
Alfonso Cuarón, started being a little bit more gritty sort of adaptation. And by the time I think David Yates got on it just became dark.
But that kind of serves a story. I mean, like, you have that allegory from innocence to experience. And when he first learns about it, he sees, flying pumpkins, and he goes to a magical mess hall where all the food pops up out of nowhere. And obviously there are some darker elements towards the end of it. But I feel like Chris Columbus, the guy who did Jumanji and the guy who did, what else did he do? I think he did Home Alone as well. Like, kind of like...
the original, sure. Yeah.
So, like, to have someone like that who's versed in, like, having a story appeal to general masses and families and, more importantly, children, I think that's a really good choice. But I would argue that the third book, The Prisoner of Azkaban, is probably the introduction to the more dark elements.
Absolutely.
Because... for the first 2 books, you have like this kind of whimsical, magical fairyland. And then at the end of the story, you have the kind of dark catharsis that happens, and you learn a little bit more about Lord Voldemort and Harry Potter.
Right.
And I feel like most, if not all, of the book of The Prisoner of Azkaban, I mean, starting off with the Dementor attack in, like, I think it was the first, 5 or 6 chapters of the book, that was kind of the turning point of the series. Like, okay, this is not just a magical fairyland story. This is something that's actually going to cause the main character to mature in a way that he didn't really think possible.
Right.
And Alfonso Cuarón's a great person for that, because he is very good at crafting dark cinematic stories, but also conveying an overall message. And I think his camera work is a great way to look at that.
Yeah.
He all of his shots, most of them utilize multiple stages of framing. For example, instead of cutting shots, he has the camera follow along with the characters, and they'll go into different frames of shots. And most of his shots are longer than like 20 seconds, almost like a Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
But in that way, we are not able to relax. We're not able to take a breath because the character kind of serves as this ominous presence that is kind of omnipotent in the story.
Yeah.
And so we're not really given a chance to breathe. And so therefore we're even more engaged in the story. So I think that Alfonso Cuarón was probably the most effective, the person to take the Harry Potter world in a new direction in terms of the films. It had
absolutely.
that kind of darker, ominous perspective as opposed to the whimsical stuff that Chris Columbus did.
Yeah.
And everything kind of followed suit after that, for sure.
And very well said. I think nice of you to really touch on the cinematic techniques that he utilizes in good detail. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is one of the other elements of world building, at least in epic fantasy sort of storytelling, is the concept of you have some type of fate, and that fate is usually foreshadowed through some type of prophecy. And the third book is the first time we hear a particular prophecy that you have Harry Potter and Voldemort. Their fates are intertwined. One must die while neither must live while the other survive, or something like that.
Wasn't that the fifth book though? Wasn't that number?
No, I'm sorry. That was the fifth book. But yeah, you're right. But there was a prophecy about his servant escaping.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
we learned about like the fact that Voldemort is not just this main character that like hates Harry Potter and wants him dead. We
Right.
actually learned that like their fates are intertwined.
There,
The glass prophecy ball that smashes in the
that is
that's
in the fifth book. You're right.
But you're absolutely right.
But
that,
the prophecy about his servant being released and going back to his master.
Yeah.
You do have that beginning of some type of stake where you have your main character going against, his nemesis.
and building up to something, a kind of a climactic catharsis.
Exactly. And so the other, some of the other things are, this was a very important chapter because it sort of sets up the characterization of Harry Potter, which would allow him to succeed in such a battle, which is, to be honest, his main strength is his extraordinary capacity for emotion, especially love and positive emotions. And the way we see that, which is I think is very, very well executed, was his ability to generate Patronus, which they established as one of the most advanced pieces of magic, and it was almost unprecedented for somebody his age to be able to conjure a Patronus. Especially not one that was fully formed.
And
that
a
was
long-lasting one, too.
A long-lasting one who, destroyed, not destroyed, but expelled hundreds of Dementors at the same time to save somebody's life. So that's when you sort of get a glimpse of Harry Potter's, extraordinary capacity to love, because he was trying to save his godfather's life. Somebody who he basically just got to know. And that was his last connection to any type of family that he had. So it actually was something meaningful. We see how that manifested itself later on when he was fighting against Voldemort in the fourth book, and you had the spell where both of their wands were connected.
Priori Incantatem.
Yeah, Priori Incantatem. It was Harry Potter's sheer will, that allowed him to actually win that battle. And regenerate the spirits of the last 5 people that Voldemort had killed, including his parents. And that was a nice catharsis for him to be able to see them like that. In the 5th book, Voldemort does try to possess him, and finds it unbearable to do so because of Harry Potter's capacity to love. So you see all of those sort of qualities starting to come about with your main character, and that is exactly how. In the end, he will end up defeating his enemy, and that's actually how it works. So you can say that the Deathly Hallows themselves, even though they were a late addition to the sort of canon of the book, they ended up mattering to some degree, but it was really Harry Potter's sheer will that allowed him to defeat Voldemort.
Well, I mean, I agree that even though the Deathly Hallows were kind of a later MacGuffin in the series, I mean, they're teased throughout all of the books. I mean, you see, well, they talk about, Dumbledore's wand being the most powerful in existence and stuff, even before they even introduce the story of the three brothers.
Right.
The invisibility cloak obviously comes in.
We've
and-
known it since the beginning.
Exactly.
And we knew it was extraordinary because you couldn't summon it. You couldn't do it. It was impervious to magic.
Yeah.
And you didn't understand why until once again she reveals it towards the end of the work.
Yeah, and when Ron sees it, he's like astounded, like, oh my God, they're so rare. How did you even find this?
Right.
We understand that like there's a certain prestige to these objects. We learn about Dumbledore's wand, and then obviously the Resurrection Stone doesn't come in until the actual final
Yeah.
book. But the objects, like we've just said all along, I mean, they follow a very consistent internal logic, and that can only be possible when the author actually conceives of the story and knows the bids that he or she wants to make, and then how she actually wants to deliver upon them in the end.
Right.
And I feel like, yeah, you're absolutely right. The Deathly Hallows, even though they're late, they're a perfect addition to the actual canon of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would just say Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, those are just examples of very carefully and very completely laid out worlds. And, you have the characters who exist within them. It's a perfectly logical world, and you actually have, and you as the audience member can really buy into and sort of become an expert in that sort of world.
Sure.
And it gives you sort of the, it's actually fairly intimidating because you say, well, can somebody really top that? To what extent can you really imagine a completely novel and innovative world where you can have such attention to detail and such internal consistency within the work?
Yeah, because even before those movies are released, like even from the first time that those books were released for Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, people bought into that world almost immediately.
Right.
And so you have to, look at that and just be completely awestruck. Like, wow, like this person not only conceived of this world like completely through their own accord, but they executed it in a way where so many people were able to latch onto it almost immediately.
Right.
There are people who have like, college courses on Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and all of this really kind of fantastical. I would say that Harry Potter is more low fantasy and high fantasy, but those kind of fantastical elements, that should be inherently ridiculous. Like they're just follow a chain of logic and a chain of rules that, I mean, I don't really even think that people who read those stories really, I don't think they even really understand or they even notice all those traces of logic, but they're there in the background
Right.
for, to make the story actually coherent and follow a general structure. That's,
Yeah.
it's hard. It's hard to do for sure. I mean, like when I was a kid, I would try and write stories and like they would just be complete crap because, I wasn't spending enough time either. Maybe I'm not just talented enough to do that, but there has to be a lot of time and effort spent into the actual formulation phase, even before you actually put pen to paper.
Right.
Yeah.
Part of it is what is your inspiration from? You can argue somebody like Tolkien, somebody like J.K. Rowling, they were both inspired by some aspects of mythology. But mythology from the countries that they're from, United Kingdom sort of mythology. Obviously some creatures like dragons are somewhat more universal than that, but a lot of the elements that they have in their books are sort of inspired from mythology.
Yeah.
And, you look at the mythology that is very rich. Norse mythology is pretty rich, so you can build an entire world around Thor, for example, at Marvel, that could be internally consistent within the bounds set by that mythology. Greek mythology obviously is very often mined, especially in comic books or something like Shazam. Shazam itself being an acronym for all of the different Greek gods.
Is it really?
Yeah, I think, H is like Hermes or speed.
Z is obviously Zeus.
Z is Zeus, and Mercury, I think, Mars, Shazam.
I had no idea that it was actually a Greek inspired
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
I'm the worst Greek person ever. I had no idea.
Yeah, it's something worth looking into for sure. But that's what I understand. I think all of those letters like S, H, A, R, A, Z, A, M all stand for different Greek gods and whatever sort of attribute that they build. So like Hermes is he's god of speed. So like the Flash would be the Hermes
Yeah,
So
Apollo, the god of
equivalent.
flight, or the god of it's the rising sun, right?
Right, the
Yeah.
rising sun.
And then Zeus is basically all
Zeus,
powerful
all
slash like
powerful.
lightning.
So like Shazam's strength comes from Zeus, Shazam's speed comes from Hermes, etc., etc. It's things like that. So those are works that are you can clearly see what their origins are. At the same time, there are perfectly satisfying worlds that are also based on things that actually happened in real life. So Game of Thrones is a great example of that.
Sure.
So for example, the initial you could say the forefront story of Game of Thrones is inspired by the War of the Roses. You have the Lannisters versus the Starks, which perfectly mimics what happens between the Lancasters and the Yorks. Once again, British history. Being able to mine that and apply it to a completely different world that has magical realism in it. You have dragons living within it. You have some aspect of magic. You have these White Walkers and the Night King. It's fantastical elements within the human story, because you can say that Game of Thrones really at its core is a political sort of story.
Yeah, sure.
The Game of Thrones itself, the title refers to a very human desire to occupy political discourse, a very human desire to occupy the highest throne that's available to us. And you have these different clans trying to aspire towards it. But at the same time, interspersed within that story, you have elements of magic realism, and all of them being consistent within the larger story. And so that is something that the inspiration for a well-built world could be wide-ranging, from complete mythology to something that actually happened in history. Or there are cases where we do have recent examples of some worlds that were built that you can say are relatively novel, but still have some inspiration from other sources as well.
Yeah, and going on that point, I think that a good example of that is probably, like you said before, Avatar, James Cameron's Avatar.
Yep.
Where it's
good movie.
Yeah.
Solid movie. Solid movie.
I would contest that Avatar. I don't think that it should have been a front runner for Best Picture when it was released in 2009. Like, technologically marvelous, but the fact that there was a debate between what's going to win, The Hurt Locker or Avatar, I think that was like kind of.
Yeah, the Oscars usually comes down to two final candidates that are very different.
Yeah, but it's just, I feel like that was just kind of an easy cash grab or an easy ratings grab. James Cameron and his ex-wife who made the better movie. You have James Cameron, this super prestigious director, and then you have Catherine Bigelow, who's only done a couple, but solid movies, but only a couple, and then. I guess, the Nerd Writer on YouTube, the guy who does video essays about movies and political stuff, he did a segment on Avatar. Basically, he was doing a video on spectacle eclipsing story, and how the fact that The Hurt Locker won over the Avatar was kind of an affirmation that Hollywood still cares about good movies as opposed to just financially successful movies.
Sure. And I think the biggest knock on Avatar, even though it was a completely novel world, well built,
It's derivative.
And the story itself is completely derivative. It's not. It's Dancing with Wolves. Yeah. So.
No, did you see South Park with that? They did oh my god, it was brilliant.
Yeah. So obviously, a lot of people have not missed that detail, that it's a completely unoriginal story, but you do set it within a world that is, and you can see the internal logic there. Obviously. What is the human's interest in that planet?
Ripping off the resources.
Ripping off the resources, exactly, and not caring about what it means for the natives. You just want to, and they call the metal unobtainium, which is a very ironic
and also a not very well named thing. But
yeah, perhaps not.
I was wondering, is it really hard to obtain? I'm not really sure.
Yeah,
But no, I would agree, and even though the story is a complete ripoff of Dance with Wolves. I think that the world itself is actually fairly well built.
Yes.
You can say what you want about the quality of the film. Like, I'm not a huge fan of it, but like the Na'vi being an indigenous race, and that kind of has parallels between the settlers that came in 1492 to America and basically wiped out the Native American Indians. And also you have elements of environmentalism and climate
Right.
change, and the fact that you have all these big oil and big facilities that are coming in to try and take the resources away from the planet, and
Right.
that kind of has implications for the modern world.
Yeah.
I think that the world is fairly well built. You have the Navi language, you have all those different creatures, you have Daruk Makto, and like you have those legendary elements, you have the
Ewa.
Awa, like you have
Yeah.
some kind of semblance of religion, which I think is pretty cool. And then you have like
Right.
the ponytails that can like plug into
Yeah,
things. And,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like I feel like the mechanics of it, like the biology and the mythology of it, are actually fairly well laid out.
Right.
I mean,
It makes sense, you know.
yeah, for sure.
You see to yourself what aspects of that planet would make these beings look like the way they do. You know, you have these 8 foot, 9 foot tall beings that are blue. You know, first of all, what does the blue color on their skin mean? It probably means something. The fact that they're so tall, maybe that's a aspect of gravity. Or the atmosphere. So, the humans can't really breathe that atmosphere, but these creatures biologically, you can say that they biologically was well built to respond to their environment.
For sure.
The animals, you have multiple limbed animals, they're very heavy. If your humanoid beings are so big and tall, then the other types of animals would be commensurately big.
Yeah.
So the physics hold in that respect. You do have, these floating mountains and the waterfalls, which sort of defy what our understanding of gravity is, but on that planet, probably not.
Yeah, it's light years away, and
Yeah. So, James Cameron is known to be somebody very meticulous who also cares about the details. And
no, for sure.
he's actually a very petty guy as well. So I remember, there was, I think it was one reissue of Titanic where he was asked to, obviously Titanic happened in 1912, so he was asked to reproduce the events of 1912. And I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson called him out on Twitter saying that the skyline for that night in 1912 is not accurate. And James Cameron, being the petty person that he is, actually went back and changed it.
Wow.
So he's the kind of person who really cares about the details. So therefore, when he embarked on this project to determine a very novel and completely unprecedented world, he wanted to make sure that all of the small details fit into the picture. So in terms of the fauna and the flora obviously would probably be something that is fluorescent, given the fact that all of these creatures are colored.
Yeah.
But then you also have the fauna being just extremely large, because perhaps their gravity is not as large as it is on our planet. So beings can afford to be bigger. The reason why there are no land animals that are very big is because you can't really go too much bigger than the elephants or dinosaurs. That's
yeah, exactly.
It just physically will not scale. The environment itself will have to be different in order for them to reach those sizes.
Yeah.
So whales, who have a sort of limited skeleton compared to land animals, can be as big as possible. Like blue whales are the biggest mammals on Earth.
Yeah.
And that's because their biology allows for them to be so big.
Yeah, the skeleton's relatively simple as opposed to their muscular and kind of fat elements.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, the little details like that matter. And so being able to establish that takes a lot. And, most importantly, they had a new language.
Yeah.
So obviously they wouldn't, these creatures wouldn't really speak English. But the only reason why they would speak English is you had a previous mission where,
to translate and establish an actual a segue between English and the Navi language.
So Sigourney Weaver's character had been there before, had been there for years, making contact with them and teaching them English. So you have that sort of diplomatic relationship open. And it makes sense for them to try to seek a diplomatic solution before a military one. But then it also makes sense to have this sort of warhawk military character who doesn't really care about diplomacy and just wants to utilize his big guns and take over the land. So all of these things make sense. In that sense, I would say Avatar was a well conceptually designed world, but obviously it's not sufficient to just design a world. You have to have a story to serve it, and unfortunately the story itself had to be perhaps derivative. But we do have hopes. He's coming out with a list of many different sequels, taking us to new aspects of the world. So underwater, what's going to be the logic of the underwater worlds? If our blue whales can be much bigger than our land animals, you can imagine the creatures underwater in that world should be very big as well.
Yeah.
So we were just looking forward to seeing what he does and how he continues to expand this world that he's telling stories about.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the only thing I'm concerned about for that world is, when you have an adaptation of source material, that's one thing. I mean, you can film movies out of sequence. Like, Peter Jackson famously filmed The Lord of the Rings in no sequence at all. He did scene from Lord of the Rings, then in the last movie, and then he went back to the Fellowship of the Ring, and he kind of filmed them all interspersed. So the thing I'm concerned about with that world is we don't really know all the implications of the world yet. We've seen a movie, and we kind of have a general idea of what's going on with that. But if James Cameron, like he said, tries to film it out of sequence, I feel like the world's going to be completely segmented and not really ascertainable to what the logic of the world is.
Right.
And I feel like maintaining that logic is very important. And
it's the story that has to tie it together.
Exactly.
And, he's writing the scripts. Well, actually, I think he's actually bringing in script writers this time. He imagined the world. He's done that work already. It's already established.
Yeah.
But now you have to have proper script writers to come in and craft a story around it, which is going to make it compelling for us, the audience, to watch, and actually will help the world building actually have meaning, have proper meaning and importance.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, you have to head out.
Right? Head out back to Indianapolis.
Right.
Naptown.
All right, so this is a good, I think, part one of this, and so we kind of talked about some worlds that have been meticulously crafted.
We talked about the obvious ones. Perhaps in part two we can, go back to
more obscure ones,
and what worked in those cases, and if they were to be reimagined today, what would they look like? Something like that.
Yeah, so we'll go into some of the more minutia of the world building, and then we'll go into maybe some worlds that didn't work so well, and I'm looking forward to the part two, man.
Sounds good. Until next time.
All right. Thanks for listening. All right. See you later.